In the 1850s, the largest, most advanced standing army in the world did not belong to a sovereign nation.
No, it didn't.
It didn't belong to an empire or a king. It belonged to a corporation.
Right, a corporate entity.
A corporation that had just paid for a private continental war using tax money, extracted from the very people it was subjugating.
Exactly.
Welcome to this documentary exploration for Peak to Dust, where we chronicle the meteoric rise and the inevitable devastating collapse of historical giants.
Yes, and today's subject is truly unprecedented.
Today, we are taking you into the ledger books and battlefields of an entity that completely erased the line between merchant and monarch, the English East India Company.
It is a history you really have to hear to believe.
Our sources for this investigation are exhaustive, and frankly, they are chilling.
Very chilling.
We will be examining the original royal charters, the meticulous financial appendices of colonial India, parliamentary impeachment records, and historical treatises on the precise legal nature of sovereignty.
Because this really is a study of power in its most concentrated, unaccountable form.
Exactly. So let us unpack this dark and complex history.
The mission of our investigation today is to dissect a terrifying metamorphosis.
Right.
We are going to map out exactly how a joint stock company, formed by a syndicate of private individuals merely seeking a profit in the spice trade.
Just merchants, essentially.
Right, just merchants. How they mutated over 2.5 centuries into a sovereign military power ruling 1/5 of the global population.
It is staggering.
And, crucially, we must investigate how it ultimately collapsed utterly under the sheer weight of its own internal corruption, endless violence, and administrative overreach.
So to comprehend the magnitude of this ruin, you first have to understand the specific mechanical foundations upon which this corporate empire was constructed.
Yes. The genesis of this entity begins in the twilight of the 16th century.
Right, the precise date is December 31st, 1600.
Exactly. Queen Elizabeth I affixes her royal seal to a charter granting a 15-year trade monopoly.
To a group calling itself the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading with the East Indies.
This document gave a select group of nobles and traders exclusive rights to all English commerce in any lands and islands east of the Cape of Good Hope, all the way to the Straits of Magellan.
But looking at the historical context of 1600, this was not a move born of grand imperial ambition.
No, not at all.
The English crown was relatively weak, financially stretched, and locked in conflict with Spain.
Right.
The formation of the East India Company was driven by an acute commercial panic.
Precisely. To understand that panic, you have to look across the English Channel to the Dutch.
The Dutch, right.
At the time, the Dutch, along with the Portuguese, completely controlled the perilous maritime routes to the Indian Ocean.
And we are talking about spices here.
Yes. Spices, specifically pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and mace. They were not mere culinary luxuries in early modern Europe.
No, they were essential.
They were critical for preserving meat over long winters, they were utilized extensively in medicine, and they represented the ultimate status symbol of wealth.
So the Dutch monopolists recognized their leverage.
Exactly. And they abruptly orchestrated a massive price shock.
Just a total manipulation of the market.
In a single sweep, the cost of pepper on the European market went from 3 shillings a pound to 6 and 8 shillings a pound.
That is an overnight price increase of over 100% on a foundational commodity.
Right.
If you translate that to a modern economic context, imagine an overseas cartel suddenly doubling the price of crude oil or semiconductor chips.
It threatens the entire economic stability of the state.
The English merchants had to respond, but they did not have the capital of a nation-state behind them.
No, they did.
The vehicle they chose to facilitate this response was, at the time, completely revolutionary. The joint stock company.
The joint stock structure is perhaps the most consequential financial innovation in modern history.
It really is.
Before this, if you engaged in maritime trade, you operated under a system of infinite risk.
Meaning personal ruin?
Exactly. If you funded a ship and it sank in a storm, or was captured by pirates off the Malabar coast, you were personally liable for all the debts.
You could be thrown into debtor's prison.
Your entire family could be ruined.
Right.
The joint stock structure introduced the legal fiction of limited liability.
It severed the personal ruin from the corporate loss.
Precisely. Investors contributed capital to a central pool, receiving shares in the enterprise.
So if the voyages failed, the investor only lost the specific amount of money they had put in, nothing more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This structural guarantee allowed the East India Company to aggregate unprecedented amounts of capital from hundreds of individuals.
Wealth that would eventually allow them to fund maritime fleets rivaling the national navies of Europe.
And the initial returns on those early voyages were just staggering.
The financial ledgers indicate that the first 12 voyages to the East Indies produced an average profit of 138%.
A massive return on investment.
But I want to pause here. Because it is incredibly easy for you, the observer looking backward from the 19th century, to assume these English merchants arrived in the East as conquerors, commanding immediate dominance.
That is a very common misconception.
The reality in the early 1600s was the exact opposite.
Right.
They were heavily restricted, vulnerable, and operating merely as desperate supplicants.
Yes. When their ships finally anchored off the coast of the Indian subcontinent, they were facing the Mughal Empire,
Which was an extraordinarily wealthy, centralized state.
It boasted a standing army of 4 million soldiers.
4 million.
The early company officials were in absolutely no position to dictate terms of any kind.
No. They were forced to travel to the inland court of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, prostrate themselves, and negotiate commercial agreements merely to be granted permission to establish their first tiny trading post, or factory, at Surat in 1613.
Their precarious early position becomes even more apparent when we analyze the specific economic mechanics of this trade.
The trade deficit.
Exactly. The East India Company faced a severe structural deficit in their commerce with Asia.
Because England produced very little that the Eastern empires actually wanted,
Precisely. The primary English export was heavy woolen broadcloth.
which, if you consider the semi-tropical climates of the Indian subcontinent, or the sweltering heat of trading ports like Canton.
Heavy woolens were entirely useless.
Right.
The weavers and merchants of the Mughal Empire demanded one thing in exchange for their highly sophisticated textiles and spices.
Precious metals.
Yes, silver and gold.
Therefore, the company was forced to rely heavily on exporting massive quantities of physical silver bullion to fund its purchases.
Which introduces an immediate contradiction.
Yes, under the prevailing economic theory of the time, mercantilism, a nation's wealth was measured by the amount of gold and silver it kept within its borders.
Exactly.
Sending tons of silver out of London on ships bound for Asia would have been viewed by Parliament and the Crown as a direct draining of England's lifeblood.
It was a massive point of political friction. To justify this outflow of silver, the company's directors had to demonstrate that their operations ultimately enriched the nation.
And they did this by establishing the famous triangular trade.
Yes. The mechanics worked like this. The company exported silver bullion from London to India.
Okay.
In places like Surat or Madras, they exchanged that silver for exquisitely woven Indian cottons and silks.
Right.
They then shipped those Indian textiles further east to the Indonesian archipelago, trading them for highly prized spices.
And then the final leg.
Finally, they returned those spices to London, where they were sold at massive markups, not just to English consumers, but re-exported to the rest of Europe for even more silver.
The sheer physical volume of this trade rapidly transformed the global economy.
It truly did.
By the end of the 17th century, the East India Company was exporting 90,000 pounds of pepper annually.
A staggering amount.
The customs records show that average imports from Asia increased by an astonishing 300% between the years 1660 and 1690.
This massive influx of goods altered the very fabric of consumer culture in England.
People stopped wearing heavy, drab woolens and began wearing brightly colored, lightweight Indian calicos and chintzes.
And as this consumer revolution took hold, the company's coffers filled with unprecedented, unimaginable wealth.
But this accumulation of wealth generated a terrifying logistical dilemma.
Yes, it did.
The East India Company was operating in regions requiring a sailing time of 5 to 6 months in one direction.
Right.
If a company warehouse in Bengal was threatened by a rival European power, like the French or the Dutch, or if local political stability fractured, they could not simply send a letter to London and wait a year for a naval squadron to arrive.
That delay would be catastrophic.
Exactly. The absolute necessity of protecting these lucrative, thousands of miles-long supply chains necessitated a fundamental shift in the company's institutional DNA.
They could no longer rely on the British Crown for protection.
No.
They required their own mechanisms of statehood. They needed the authority to project lethal force.
Which brings us to a chilling legal evolution.
Very chilling.
The original charter of 1600 was merely a license to trade. But as we look at the subsequent royal charters, particularly those issued in 1661 by Charles II and later in 1670, we see a shift.
A massive shift. We see the English crown systematically delegating sovereign state-level powers to a board of corporate directors.
The company was officially granted the right to raise its own private military forces.
Yes.
They were authorized to construct heavily armed stone fortresses.
They were given the power to make peace treaties or wage outright war against any non-Christian nation at their own discretion.
And they were granted the authority to administer criminal justice, including capital punishment, in the territories they occupied.
Furthermore, in 1677, this corporate body was granted a power that historically has always been the exclusive, sacred prerogative of the sovereign state.
The right to mint its own currency.
Exactly. The company established mints and began striking the silver rupiah, the gold moher, the phenems, and cash coins. What is analytically crucial here is the emergence of a concept that political historians term layered sovereignty.
Layered sovereignty.
Yes. We often think of sovereignty as an indivisible absolute. A monarch or a modern nation-state possesses ultimate authority, and it cannot be shared.
Right.
But in the early modern period, sovereignty was divisible. The English crown explicitly franchised its sovereign violence and administrative authority out to the company.
It is essentially a geopolitical franchise model.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Just as a modern fast food corporation licenses its branding and operational systems to an independent owner to shield the parent company from liability, the British Crown licensed its sovereign authority to the East India Company.
Yes.
This allowed the British state to project imperial power, expand its global footprint, and counter rival nations without directly financing armies or taking responsibility for the inevitable violence.
Exactly. The British state outsourced its empire building to a corporation.
With devastating results.
And the result was that the East India Company developed a schizophrenic dual personality.
Right.
In London, they were mere merchants, subjects of the crown, who had to bribe members of parliament and petition the king to maintain their monopoly.
But in Asia, they acted as supreme, unaccountable rulers, commanding fleets, building forts, and minting coins. Consider a modern mercantile conglomerate for a moment. Now imagine that corporation not merely negotiating trade tariffs, but being legally authorized to mint its own physical currency, administer its own courts of law, where it acts as both judge and executioner, and deploy its own armed forces to annex sovereign territory.
It is the realization of unchecked corporate power in its purest, most lethal form.
It is a terrifying realization.
And when that power was challenged, the company fiercely defended its right to act as a sovereign state.
We see that defense explicitly articulated in the historical record during the 1683 to 1684 trial of East India Company v. Sandys.
Yes. Thomas Sandys was an English merchant who attempted to bypass the company's monopoly and trade directly in the East Indies.
So the company sued him in the Court of Chancery in London.
And during this trial, the company did not just argue about trade regulations, they openly articulated their self-perception as a state power.
They argued that in the East Indies, it was the company, and explicitly not the English crown, that maintained the physical and political infrastructure of commerce.
They argued that they had built the forts, they had conducted the diplomacy with foreign monarchs, and they maintained the standing armies that made English presence in Asia possible.
Therefore, they claimed, their monopoly was not just a royal favor.
Exactly. They claimed it was a sovereign right they had earned through the expenditure of blood and corporate treasure.
And the court agreed with them.
They did.
They cited the international legal theorist Hugo Grotius, suggesting that the company's long possession and defense of this trade route essentially granted them a permanent sovereign right.
To enforce this right, the company began constructing a military apparatus that defies modern comprehension.
They did not just hire a few armed guards for their warehouses.
No. They formed three distinct, massive military organizations: the Bengal Army, the Bombay Army, and the Madras Army.
The composition of these armies is vital to understanding the mechanics of their eventual empire.
These forces contained a small core of European infantry and artillery units, but they were primarily composed of native Indian troops known as sepoys.
The company meticulously exploited the existing indigenous military labor market.
Right.
They recruited high-caste Hindu and Muslim soldiers, armed them with state-of-the-art European flintlock muskets, trained them in rigid European battlefield tactics, and paid them reliably every month from the profits of their trade.
Through this synthesis of Indian manpower and European military discipline, the company created a highly effective professional fighting force that eventually swelled to 250,000 men.
I want to emphasize that number for you. 250,000
It
men.
is massive.
By the early 19th century, the East India Company's private corporate army was twice the size of the official British army stationed back in the United Kingdom.
Big.
A military machine of that scale is not built merely to protect shipping lanes or warehouse perimeters.
No, it is not.
An army of 250,000 men is built for one purpose: conquest.
Conquest. It was the instrument that would lead directly to the violent catalyst transforming the East India Company from a fabulously wealthy trading firm into a territorial empire.
That catalyst occurred on a mango grove in Bengal in 1757.
The Battle of Plassey.
Yes, the company's forces, commanded by a former accounting clerk turned military commander named Robert Clive, engaged the vast army of the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah.
Who was supported by French artillery.
Right. But it is crucial to understand that Plassey was barely a battle in the traditional military sense.
No, it was, in essence, a corporate buyout executed via a military coup.
Clive had secretly colluded with the Nawab's chief military commander, Mir Jafar, promising to place him on the throne if he withheld his troops during the battle.
And the betrayal was executed flawlessly.
Siraj-ud-Dowlah was defeated and subsequently assassinated.
But this was not a trade dispute being resolved. It was the forced regime change of an incredibly wealthy sovereign state by a foreign corporation.
And the immediate financial spoils extracted from this coup were staggering.
Unprecedented.
The ledger books show that the company seized at least £2.5 million straight from the treasuries of the defeated Bengali rulers.
Robert Clive himself, along with other senior company officers, amassed massive personal fortunes overnight through outright extortion.
Demanding millions of rupees in quote-unquote gifts from the new puppet rulers they installed.
Right. These men returned to England fabulously wealthy, bought vast estates, purchased seats in Parliament, and earned the derisive title of nabobs.
The plunder of the treasury was immensely profitable for those individuals.
Yes.
But the true prize of Plassey, the event that permanently mutated the DNA of the East India Company, was not the immediate loot.
No, it was the institutionalized extraction that followed 8 years later.
In 1765, following further military victories against Indian forces, the company cornered the weakened Mughal emperor.
They forced him to sign a treaty granting the East India Company the Diwani.
The Diwani. This is the fulcrum upon which the entire history of corporate imperialism pivots.
It absolutely is.
The Diwani was the formal, legal right to collect the land revenues and taxes of the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa.
With the stroke of a pen, a board of merchants sitting in a boardroom on Leadenhall Street in London became the de facto territorial sovereigns over millions of people.
The granting of the Diwani fundamentally altered the company's entire business model and its reason for existing.
Right. Prior to 1765, they operated under a model of mercantilism. They brought silver from Europe to buy Indian goods.
After the Diwani, they shifted entirely to a model of territorial extraction.
The Suba of Bengal, which was historically one of the most prosperous, agriculturally rich, and autonomous provinces in the world, was suddenly treated merely as a massive income-generating estate on the company's ledger books.
Let us break down the specific mechanics of how that worked, because it is diabolical in its efficiency.
It really is.
How does a handful of British corporate administrators extract wealth from an entire subcontinent?
Well, they utilized the existing Mughal tax collection infrastructure, but they applied corporate quotas to it.
The tax revenues extracted from the Bengali peasantry were no longer used to maintain local infrastructure or provide relief during droughts.
No. Instead, the company used those exact same tax revenues to purchase the Indian cotton and silk that they then exported back to Europe.
So the centuries-old necessity of exporting precious bullion from Britain vanished entirely.
Exactly. The company was now buying Indian goods using India's own money and then keeping the profits from the global sale of those goods.
If we step back and connect this to the broader theories of statecraft, we see the operation of a dynamic defined by historians as War awakens sovereigns.
Yes, when the East India Company became continuously entangled in funding massive armies, prosecuting wars, negotiating peace treaties, and organizing the complex division of captured tax revenues, it awakened a self-possessed sovereignty within the corporation.
They no longer saw their power as merely a franchise delegated by the English crown.
By holding the Diwani, maintaining a 250,000-man army, and ruling vast territories by right of conquest, the company's directors began to view their sovereignty as an inherent independent right won by the sword.
But I am looking at these ledgers, and a massive contradiction emerges for you, the observer.
What is that?
The company is a joint stock enterprise. Its legal fiduciary duty is to generate profits and pay dividends to its shareholders.
Right.
War, however, is an incredibly expensive, capital-destroying endeavor. How did they justify to you, the observer, the exorbitant cost of maintaining 250,000 soldiers?
It is a critical question.
If they control the trade, why are they spending millions on artillery and siege trains?
They justified it because for the men actually running the company, the officers on the ground and the directors in London War was immensely personally lucrative.
Right, the personal wealth.
A military victory in India meant the immediate acquisition of prize money distributed among the officers. It meant the extraction of massive, punitive annuities from subjugated local princes who were forced to pay for the very British troops occupying their lands.
And most importantly, territorial conquest meant control of vast new tax revenues.
Exactly. These revenues were used to pay artificially high dividends to keep shareholders happy, but vast sums were also redirected to fund massive lobbying and bribery efforts back in London, ensuring that Parliament would not interfere with their lucrative monopoly.
War paid for the politics, and the politics protected the war.
The sheer scale of this wealth extraction is almost beyond human comprehension, but we have the specific financial data from the colonial appendices to quantify it.
And the numbers are staggering.
Between the years 1765 and 1771, the gross tax collections in Bengal amounted to £20,133,579.
After deducting the tribute paid to the Mughal emperor, the allowances to local puppet figureheads, and the administrative charges of collection, the company yielded a pure net revenue of £13,066,761 in just 6 years.
And when economic historians aggregate the calculated total gross revenue systematically extracted by the company from the Indian subcontinent between 1762 and 1857, the figure reaches 89,417,249,059 pounds.
Adjusted for 2019 value, that is roughly 89.4 billion pounds completely drained from the local economy.
This unprecedented astronomical transfer of wealth did not occur in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It came at a devastating, unfathomable human cost.
The relentless corporate drive for higher quarterly tax yields, combined with the strict monopolization of internal trade by company employees, completely hollowed out the local Indian economy.
The peasantry was left with absolutely no margin for survival.
And this ruthless extraction triggered the very forces of institutional decay and catastrophic mismanagement that would eventually tear the company apart from the inside out.
Which brings us to the darkest, most harrowing chapter of this corporate reign.
The 1770s marked the definitive turning point.
It was a decade characterized by catastrophic overreach, unimaginable human suffering, and what is effectively the first major corporate bailout in global history.
In 1770, a devastating famine struck the province of Bengal.
The human toll is staggering.
It is estimated by historical demographers that 10 million people, roughly one-third of the entire population of the province, perished from starvation and subsequent disease.
To understand the culpability of the East India Company in this tragedy, we must examine the logistics of famine in the region.
Right.
Famines caused by the failure of the monsoon rains were a known environmental hazard in India. Historically, they were mitigated by the administrative reserves of the local Mughal rulers, who would open granaries, suspend tax collection, and distribute relief.
But the East India Company was not a traditional benevolent ruler bound by a social contract with its subjects.
No, it was a profit-driven enterprise answering to shareholders in London.
During the absolute height of this mass starvation, the company's leadership did not suspend taxes.
They actually exacerbated the crisis through specific documented administrative orders.
The details of those orders are horrifying.
They are.
As millions of people were dying of starvation in the streets of Calcutta and the surrounding countryside, The company's administrators aggressively enforced regulations against hoarding grain.
Which effectively dismantled the local organic networks of relief and distribution.
They forcefully bought up massive quantities of the surviving rice crops, specifically to feed their own private sepoy armies.
Ensuring their military asset was protected while the civilian population starved.
And most chillingly, the company made the deliberate bureaucratic decision to actually increase the land tax assessment on the surviving dying population by 10%, explicitly to ensure their revenue streams to London remained uninterrupted.
They literally extracted taxes from the dead and dying.
The local tax collectors, under immense pressure from the company, enforced collections with brutal physical violence.
And yet, despite this ruthless, sociopathic level of extraction, a profound structural irony emerged.
The company's financial architecture was collapsing under its own weight.
By 1772, just 2 years after the worst of the famine, the mighty East India Company was nearly bankrupt.
The costs of their endless, expanding military campaigns, the staggering levels of unchecked private corruption and embezzlement among their employees, and the utter devastation of their primary tax base in Bengal, because you cannot tax 10 million corpses, left the corporate treasury entirely empty.
So, an entity that had just drained millions of pounds from Bengal was suddenly unable to pay its customs duties to the British government or its dividends to its investors.
The corporate giant was forced to crawl to Westminster and plead for a massive financial bailout from the British Parliament.
This specific historical moment birthed the modern economic concept of a corporation being too big to fail.
Too big to fail.
The company's lobbyists argued to Parliament that if the East India Company were allowed to go insolvent, it would mean the total collapse of British geopolitical dominance in the subcontinent.
It would mean the loss of tens of thousands of jobs in London, the ruination of powerful shareholders, and the loss of a massive, vital revenue stream for the British state itself.
Parliament responded to the panic, but the era of unchecked sovereign corporate autonomy was permanently over.
The state intervened, but it demanded structural control in exchange for the capital.
Parliament authorized a £1.5 million bailout loan to save the company from immediate ruin.
But they paired it with the Regulating Act of 1773 and subsequently Pitt's India Act of 1784.
These legislative actions fundamentally shifted the balance of power. They established a governmental board of control in London to oversee the company's political and military affairs.
They strictly capped the maximum dividends that could be paid out to shareholders.
And, most importantly, from a legal standpoint, Parliament formally declared that any territorial acquisitions made by subjects of the Crown belonged by right to the state, not to the corporation.
I have to interject to emphasize the sheer audacity of the company's defense during this crisis.
It is vital to note.
When faced with parliamentary oversight, the court of directors did not issue apologies for the famine that eradicated 10 million lives.
No, they didn't.
They did not express remorse for the gross mismanagement and violent extraction in their territories. Instead, they formally petitioned Parliament, framing government oversight as an outrageous, tyrannical infringement on their sacred rights and their private property.
They argued that regulating their administration in India was a direct violation of their historic corporate charters.
Think about the pure, distilled entitlement of that argument.
It is staggering.
They view the absolute sovereign control over millions of lives and the revenues of an entire subcontinent not as a solemn duty, but as a private commercial property right that the government had no business interfering with.
It is a chilling display of corporate logic, completely divorced from any sense of human consequence or morality.
This profound disconnect prompted the leading intellectuals of the era to diagnose the structural impossibility of the company's very existence.
Yes. In 1776, Adam Smith published his foundational text, The Wealth of Nations. He dedicated significant portions of it to critiquing the East India Company, arguing precisely that a sovereign power holding a trade monopoly cannot possibly rule with fairness to its subjects.
Smith laid out the irreconcilable conflict of interest. The fundamental motivation of a merchant is to buy as cheaply as possible and sell as dearly as possible,
which is fundamentally incompatible with the duties of a sovereign, whose primary motivation must be the economic prosperity and security of the governed.
Furthermore, a parliamentarian and former company employee named William Boltz wrote a scathing critique in 1772, exposing the utter absurdity of vesting a body of mere traders with unlimited sovereign authority.
He argued that allowing merchants to rule meant allowing them to securely play their own game of advantage to the absolute prejudice and ruin of millions.
And the downstream geopolitical effects of Parliament propping up this failing, corrupt corporate behemoth rippled violently across the globe.
Yes, they did.
To help the bankrupt East India Company liquidate its massive, unsold surplus of Chinese tea sitting in London warehouses, the British government passed the Tea Act of 1773.
This granted the company extended privileges and direct tax exemptions over the tea trade in North America, allowing them to undercut local colonial merchants.
This blatant, direct legislative favoritism, designed purely to save a corrupt monopoly, deeply enraged American colonists.
It was the direct catalyst for the Boston Tea Party, heavily accelerating the outbreak of the American Revolution.
The bailout of a corporation in India helped trigger the loss of a continent in America.
While Parliament attempted to rein in the company through these various legislative acts, the stark geographic reality rendered much of this oversight purely theoretical.
A letter containing instructions from the Board of Control took 6 months to travel by sail from London to Calcutta.
By the time an order arrived, the political reality on the ground had already changed, or a war had already been fought.
In that massive interim of communication, local governors and administrators operated as absolute despots.
Without immediate accountability, the system succumbed to rampant systemic corruption and institutional decay.
We see the ultimate theatrical culmination of this institutional decay in the epic parliamentary impeachment trial of Warren Hastings, the first official Governor-General of Bengal.
From 1788 to 1795, Hastings faced trial in the spectacular setting of Westminster Hall before the House of Lords.
The prosecution was led by the fierce, eloquent statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke.
This wasn't just a trial of a single man. It was the public prosecution of the entire corporate system.
Burke's prosecution of Hastings remains one of the most searing, comprehensive indictments of corporate overreach in political history.
Burke famously described the East India Company not as a legitimate trading body, but as a state in the disguise of a merchant.
Over the course of the 7-year trial, Burke exposed the incredibly granular, sordid details of the company's financial rot.
He didn't just speak in generalities. He brought the ledger books to the floor of Parliament.
For instance, he detailed specific instances of profound corruption, such as a £95,000 agreement negotiated by a corrupt local broker, or banyan, named Ganga Govind Singaman. Burke colorfully labeled the wickedest of the whole race.
Burke mapped out exactly how the embezzlement worked.
Right.
Out of that £95,000 agreement, Burke traced the accounting and demonstrated that £40,000 was simply sunk somewhere in a vast, untraceable labyrinth of fraud, embezzled by the various agents, fixers, and bribe brokers utilized by Hastings to maintain his grip on power.
The trial pulled back the curtain on how the wealth of India was actually being siphoned into private pockets rather than public or even corporate treasuries.
During the trial, Burke also took aim at the theoretical foundations of the company's power by reading aloud Hastings' own written defenses.
Hastings had arrogantly argued that the arbitrary, despotic sovereignty he exerted over conquered Indian territories was entirely justified.
He claimed he held this absolute power by the historic laws of the Mughal Empire, which he had inherited by right of conquest, and explicitly not by any constitutional constraint or British Act of Parliament.
Hastings essentially argued that in India, he was an absolute Oriental despot, free from British law.
Burke blistered him for this constitutional heresy.
The transcripts record Burke thundering in Westminster Hall, stating, "He claims the very power of that sovereign who calls him to account. Such a claim is a monster that never existed except in the wild imagination of some theorist."
Burke argued that arbitrary, unchecked power is illegitimate everywhere, regardless of geography, and that a British corporation cannot suddenly act as an unaccountable tyranny simply by sailing around the Cape of Good Hope.
Ultimately, Hastings was acquitted by the House of Lords, largely due to political fatigue after 7 years of trial.
But if we move past the courtroom drama and break down the financial tables from the historical appendices of the 19th century, the cold mathematical reality at the company's inevitable doom becomes undeniable.
The system was eating itself.
As the company's territorial footprint expanded, their administrative and military costs vastly outpaced their actual tax revenues.
To protect their borders, they engaged in endless, draining, continental conflicts. The Anglo-Mysore Wars, the massive Anglo-Maratha Wars, and the brutal Anglo-Sikh Wars in the Punjab.
Let us look at the ledger books for the fiscal year of 1857 to 1858 to see exactly how unsustainable this had become.
In that single year, the company's gross revenues extracted from India were an incredibly impressive 31.7 million pounds.
However, their total expenses resulted in a massive, crushing deficit of over 7.8 million pounds for that year alone.
How does an entity bringing in 31 million run an 8 million deficit?
Because the military charges, the cost of paying, arming, and supplying that vast sepoy army and prosecuting those endless wars consumed nearly 15.9 million pounds.
The company was trapped in a death spiral.
They were using massive amounts of commercial debt issued in London to fund an endless cycle of public wars in India, hoping that the next conquered province would finally balance the books.
Recognizing that this monopolistic model was entirely dysfunctional and restrictive to broader British industrial capitalism, Parliament systematically stripped the company of its remaining commercial monopolies.
First, they removed the monopoly on general trade with India in 1813. Finally, in 1833, they stripped the company of its highly lucrative monopoly on the tea trade with China.
You must ask yourself, how long can an entity survive when it uses its commercial debt to fund public wars, transferring the cost of its expansion directly onto the subjugated population?
Historically and economically, it cannot survive.
By the mid-19th century, the East India Company was a hollowed-out, paradoxical shell.
It was a massive military machine acting as a proxy state, an anomaly without parallel in global history.
It was entirely devoid of trade, drowning in debt, and ruling tens of millions of resentful subjects through the sheer brute force of a massive mercenary army.
It was a powder keg of corporate and military overreach. All it required was a single spark to ignite a total, catastrophic collapse.
That spark arrived with devastating force in 1857.
It is known historically as the Indian Mutiny, or the Sepoy Rebellion.
It began as a military mutiny of the company's own native soldiers against the British commanders.
Sparked by rumors regarding the grease used on new rifle cartridges, which offended both Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities.
But it instantly catalyzed into a massive, bloody, continental uprising.
It was fueled by decades of deep systemic grievances, profound cultural insensitivities, aggressive political annexation of sovereign princely states, and the relentless grinding economic extraction we have been detailing.
The rebellion spread rapidly across northern and central India, drawing in deposed princes, disgruntled landlords, and ordinary citizens alike, threatening to entirely eradicate the British presence in the subcontinent in a matter of months.
The rebellion brutally exposed the fundamental structural weakness and the arrogant incompetence of the company's administration.
They had built an entire empire resting squarely on the bayonets of indigenous troops, relying on their loyalty to extract wealth from their own countrymen.
When those troops finally turned their weapons against their corporate employers, the fragile company state instantly shattered.
The company's military response, heavily backed by emergency reinforcements of British Crown forces, was marked by horrific, retaliatory brutality on a massive scale.
Following the violent suppression of the insurgency, the East India Company distinguished itself for a final macabre time.
The historical records detail the company orchestrating the summary hanging and murdering of tens of thousands of suspected rebels, mutineers, and frequently innocent civilians in the bizarre towns and trees along the Ganges River.
It was a display of state terror executed by a corporate board.
But the sheer scale of the rebellion and the horrific violence of the suppression finally broke the political tolerance in London.
The British state realized that the continued existence of a corporate body possessing such immense, unaccountable military power, coupled with such a catastrophic record of governance and racial alienation, was a direct existential threat to the stability of the British Empire itself.
The franchise model had failed catastrophically. Enough was enough.
The final legislative death blow was struck by Parliament. The Government of India Act of 1858 formally stripped the East India Company of all its remaining administrative, territorial, and military powers.
The Act of 1858 marked the definitive legal end of layered sovereignty.
The British state could no longer tolerate the dangerous ambiguity of a company state that located sovereign power within its own corporate structure.
The indivisibility of state power was brutally reasserted. Queen Victoria assumed direct imperial rule over India.
In a sweeping nationalization, the British government absorbed the company's vast territories, officially nationalized its 250,000-man army into the British military, and, predictably, assumed its massive crushing debts.
The East India Company, an entity that had once commanded fleets, minted its own currency, and ruled millions, was instantly reduced to a hollow shell entity.
It became a financial ghost, existing solely in a small London office for a few more years, strictly to pay off its remaining shareholders with government funds, until it was formally and quietly dissolved by an act of Parliament in 1874.
So what does this all mean for you, studying the arcs of history?
To summarize the findings of our investigation, the English East India Company began in 1600 as a desperate, speculative venture by London merchants seeking a foothold in the lucrative spice trade.
Through the financial innovation of joint stock capital and the continuous unprecedented delegation of sovereign powers by the British Crown, it slowly transformed into a sprawling, sovereign military empire.
It minted coins, raised vast private armies, conquered ancient nations, and systematically diverted the wealth of the East into the coffers of Europe.
Yet it was ultimately dismantled and destroyed when its unchecked avarice, its structural corruption, and its administrative incompetence provoked a massive, bloody rebellion.
Rendering the corporation too dangerous, too unstable, and too costly for its own creators to tolerate.
Before we conclude this investigation, I want you to consider a final, haunting historical symmetry, a detail not found in the grand military ledgers, but in the quiet realities of the modern world.
It is a remarkable postscript.
Today, the East India Company brand name, once the banner of a ruthless, unaccountable regime that systematically drained 89 billion pounds from the Indian subcontinent, still exists.
It is currently owned by a Gujarati Indian businessman.
He uses the trademark to sell fine luxury foods, teas, and condiments from a high-end showroom in London's West End.
Furthermore, the modern descendants of Robert Clive, the man who ruthlessly plundered the treasury of Bengal and laid the blood-soaked foundations of this corporate empire, are themselves half Indian through marriage.
It is a stark, almost poetic reminder to you that empires of wealth and blood inevitably return to the dust, only to be absorbed, repurposed, and outlived by the very people they sought to permanently subjugate. Thank you for joining us on this somber documentary exploration on Peak to Dust.